Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Rethinking Resources podcast, brought to you by OMV. I'm Steve Shade, your host on this podcast journey through the biggest challenges we are facing in the climate change transformation. This season, under the topic Climate Change, we are diving boldly into hot topics, asking difficult questions, and facing the reality of the tough challenges the world is facing. In this particular episode, we are focusing on an increasingly important and popular way of measuring whether companies are walking the walk or just talking the talk when it comes to sustainability. We are talking about ESG ratings. ESG stands for Environmental, Social, and Governance. OMV has a top rating, but that did not stop the famous activist Jane Fonda from recently condemning the company. In the hot seat for us in this episode is Laura Engshuber-Wohnhaas, Senior Expert for ESG Management at OMV. Thank you so much for joining us on Rethinking Resources. Okay, to set the scene, what is an ESG rating and why does it matter?
As you said, it's all about ESG is all about measuring good in the simplest sense, and this means trying to assess whether companies are acting on everything from reducing their CO2 emissions, for instance, or also social topics such as human rights, governance topics such as having good business ethics in place, not engaging in corruption, and everything of this nature. And why it matters is really for something called sustainable investing. That's where it traditionally comes from. And that sounds a bit complex, but you can really think about it for even if yourself are an investor. So if you, for instance, say, well, I have a little bit of money lying around, I would like to invest in some stocks. And you might say, well, I would like to make sure that with my investments, I'm doing some good and I'm contributing to companies that have earned it. That's where an ESG rating comes in. So you can go to an investment manager, or if yourself are doing this, you can select companies based on ESG scores. So these are done by ESG rating agencies. And you can also, for instance, say that you would like to not invest in companies engaged in controversial areas such as tobacco or also fossil fuels, for instance. ESG ratings really provide insight so that investors, which is everyone from asset managers to individual investors, can make informed choices. It's really all about saying, well, people want to know that they're doing good with their investments and spending their money in a good way and helping people to make informed choices.
So I need to ask you when this really arrived as a big current topic. I recently spoke to a CEO of a big stock market listed company. She was preparing a keynote address and a lot of the content had been prepared for her. When I was speaking to her, she said, what I really want to talk about in my keynote is ESG ratings. This is like the most important, interesting thing we're doing right now. This is what I want to talk about, which left me with the question, when did this arrive as such a hot topic?
So sustainable investing itself has been around since at least the 1970s. This really started with investors wanting to not invest in industries involved in apartheid South Africa. But it really became a trend that you have these external agencies that do ratings in the early 2000s. You had increasingly investors saying, I don't want to only use my own criteria, I want to have an external view, a neutral view, and these agencies then sprung up to fill a void and rate companies and give advice to investors in the last 20 or so years. And sustainable investing has grown every year. I recently went to a conference where I heard that actually 40% of worldwide assets under management are now invested sustainably along the criteria of ESG rating agencies.
Okay. I think we need to address a bit of an elephant in the room. Let me read a quote from OMV. It says, so at OMV, we place great importance in working with the ESG ratings agencies. This helps us drive sustainability agendas forward and make continuous improvements in terms of sustainability. Of course, critics will say, if OMV is so enthusiastic about these ratings, there must be something suspicious going on here. What do you say to the critics?
So, it's certainly true that we do use ESG ratings, and we use them as a best practice guide. So what that means is that they will often give us advice on what external market participants are looking at for us, what society is looking at, and then we use that to inform our own strategies. So, for instance, that would say that we say, well, investors want to see that we have targets addressing all of our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, not just scope 1 and 2, which would be our operational emissions, but for an oil company, you need to address your scope 3 emissions from your products, so from the fuel that you sell. And this really also became a trend due to ESG ratings, for instance. So we really do use it as a best practice guide. And in terms of how OMV is sustainable, well, I think obviously you can debate whether there is fundamentally a way to, as a fossil fuel company, to be sustainable. I think yes, there is, as long as you're willing to drive change. So for us, that means, for instance, that we're reducing our oil and gas production, actually. We're trying to completely phase out oil and gas production by 2050. And on the short term, even, we have steps to reduce our oil and gas production, which is quite unique for us as even in our sector. It also means that we're focusing on other areas of sustainability. So that's everything from human rights to the safety of our workforce to acting ethically and in all kinds of ways. So we really do use it, and I would say that we really are trying to become a sustainable company. We're driving change. We're changing our product portfolio, for instance. So that means reducing oil, but also producing more sustainable feedstocks, for instance, sustainable aviation fuel, more sustainable forms of energy, such as geothermal, solar energy. So we're really trying to be part of the change.
So if OMV is talking the talk and walking the walk, how does it feel when a prominent figure like Jane Fonda comes to Vienna to attend an event at the State Opera, which is sponsored by OMV, and at a press conference says OMV is criminal and that its financial sponsoring should be rejected?
Yeah. I mean, I can say definitively I would not work for a criminal company, first of all. And, I think the point is well taken that it's fair to villainize or vilify oil companies that are not changing, that are resistant to change, and that assume we can just keep going as we've done for years and that our planet will continue to live somehow. At OMV, fortunately, that's not the approach we're taking, and I think that's very important to note. On the one hand, we're trying to reduce our CO2 footprint in our operations, for instance, by buying renewable energy to power operations. We're trying to reduce the emissions in our value chain, for instance, by working with our suppliers, who are also companies who have to reduce their emissions to meet the Paris Agreement goals. And very keyly, we're changing our products. So we're trying to enable people to continue to live their lives in a modern way, but do so more sustainably. So, I think a very good example of this is the travel industry. I personally like to travel. I try to live a very sustainable life, but my personal carbon footprint is largely destroyed by my flights. So, for instance, last year I went to 2 weddings of 2 of my best friends, one in Ecuador and one in Oregon on the west coast of the United States. So both of these obviously involved long flights across the Atlantic. And, it's hard to then require people to make the choice between saying you're there for one of the most important days in your friends' lives, or you are not going to touch your own carbon footprint and not travel there. So for me personally, it's a very, very good thing that companies like OMV, and specifically OMV in this case, are producing products that will enable me to continue to do this. So, for instance, sustainable aviation fuels. Those are fuels made from used cooking oil. So, for instance, the oil that you would have in your pan after you finish cooking your dinner. And these are collected and turned into jet fuel. And OMV has the goal by 2030 of producing and marketing 700 kilotons of this. This is about jet fuel that the Vienna airport uses annually. It's about 30% of the overall jet fuel that we sell, so it is a significant part of our revenues. And we're changing our business model to enable people to continue to live their lives and, live a modern life, travel, continue to live as they're used to, but to do so in a sustainable way. So I think, it should be also seen that OMV is really making a difference and changing its business model to be more sustainable.
Okay, then let's get down to details and really concrete examples. How do ESG ratings ensure the sustainability and ethical impact of a company? What do they actually require you and other companies to commit to doing?
I mean, first of all, they are, of course, a voluntary code. They're not a legislative enforcement mechanism. You will not get a fine if you do badly in an ESG rating. What it does commit you to saying is that you, towards the capital market and towards the public, say that we commit to certain things. and to then put those into place in order to continue to guarantee investment. So for instance, a rating, they measure policies, standards, measures that companies have in place, and also their performance. So very concretely, the way that we use them, for instance, is that ESG ratings have lots of standards about what a good human rights policy and human rights due diligence should look like. So last year, when we redid our human rights policy, which is we now published this year, we took into account what these different ratings are asking of us, and then we incorporate that into our policies. And now when we're rolling this out across the company, we ensure that way that it meets best practice standards. And then a rating agency would say, well, you also need to train your employees about them. And how many employees are you training? So then we also take that to affect our due diligence. We have a target to train all of our workforce in human rights by 2025. And we really use that to drive change and embed that into our company. So it's very much about voluntary commitments, but it should definitely be considered that these are the steps companies need to take to really ensure that they're sustainable in all areas.
Will it always remain voluntary? And I mean, at least here in Europe, you can't just make things up.
No, of course.
It has to be true. The EU has actually introduced new anti-greenwashing legislation, the Green Claims Initiative, which will penalize companies that make false claims with fines of at least 4% of their revenue. So that's pretty significant. If companies try to fake it, EU watchdogs are now poised to bite with real teeth, aren't they?
Yeah, of course. So yes, there's on the one hand the Green Claims Initiative that you mentioned, which is about that you need to back up that the products that you're marketing as being green are actually green. And this involves doing life cycle assessments, for instance. So for OMV, this would affect, for instance, if we are trying to sell fuel that has offset emissions. So if our customers can buy fuel and we say, well, with this, all of the CO2 emissions associated with are compensated, for instance. Then there's directives such as the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which enforces what kind of information companies report, and that'll become mandatory as well, and then make companies more comparable because it has certain standards associated with it that companies need to report. So for instance, all companies need to actually report how they're getting to a 1.5 degree transition plan, so how they're meeting the Paris Agreement in very detailed steps, how much they're investing, how much they're moving out of negative industries. And then there's, for instance, also the EU taxonomy, which has certain steps in place where companies, if they claim that an activity is green, this activity really need to demonstrably have a reduced CO2 footprint, meet CO2 thresholds. They have other criteria such as needing to do biodiversity impact assessments, for instance. And then also key is something called the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive that's coming into force, where companies need to have due diligence across their entire supply chains on environmental and human rights issues. This is very akin to the Lieferkettengesetz in Germany, so the Supply Chain Act that already came out last year. And actually now, last month, IKEA and Amazon and Tom Taylor were actually sued under the Supply Chain Act for not having enough due diligence in place in Bangladesh in their factories. So yes, the EU is definitely imposing regulation where companies will need to not only make bold claims, but really back up what they're saying. And it's an entire legislative framework that's really driving this. And that's a very, very welcome thing.
Okay, so Europe looks like it's moving in a good positive direction. What about European companies that operate internationally or big companies based outside the EU? Other countries, other regions of the world have lower standards. Isn't this a big remaining problem, a big remaining challenge?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the good thing in many ways is that, for instance, under the Supply Chain Act that's coming, companies that have $40 million in revenue in the EU can actually be sued under European law. So similar to Amazon, for instance, now being sued in Germany. So this, you do have large corporates operating in the EU will be liable. But certainly for other companies, this is not the case. And there we can only say that ESG ratings, for instance, are a driving force behind so to say, lifting all the standards worldwide, because ESG ratings are universal. They're not limited to certain countries. And in ESG ratings, a company like OMV is compared to a company like Exxon, for instance, or also, for instance, Petronas or Sinopec. So therefore, these kind of indirect standards that are being posed by these ESG rating agencies are in many countries taking the place of legislation and driving change.
So if I'm an investor and I want to put my money into something ethical, how important are ESG ratings for investors and stakeholders? Can you actually measure an increase in interest in this space?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't have the exact percentages in front of me, but as said earlier, yeah, about 40% of investing currently is using ESG criteria. And this, grows from year to year. And we do definitely see that our investors continuously ask about our ESG ratings, and that this interest has actually grown over the years. At OMV, also, our share of investors who are signing on to initiatives such as the UN Principles for Responsible Investment is growing and growing from year to year. So I think it's definitely something where, there's a lot of drive behind it. There's a lot of drive behind investors also wanting to invest sustainably. There's also legislation that applies to investors, actually, showing that they have to funnel money into more sustainable investments. So it's definitely a growing market, and it's definitely a good way to hold companies accountable.
Okay, so let's talk about what's going on in the United States. ESG ratings have taken a central role in the political divide between Democrats and Republicans. The Biden administration is strongly in favor, while the Republicans criticize the ratings as woke restrictions that could lower earnings on investments. How important is the U.S. position on ESG ratings?
Globally, yes. I mean, as you said, it's a very interesting debate. So on the one hand, you have Republican governors who in some states are, for instance, making it that any sort of state funds, so for instance, pension funds, are not allowed to be invested according to ESG criteria. And on the other hand, you have BlackRock, for instance, that's saying, well, we actually have a fiduciary duty to invest according to ESG criteria, because if you don't invest according to ESG criteria, you're probably over-investing in companies that are liable to fines for pollution, for instance, or taxes from high CO2 emissions, or also in the long term that these companies are not sustainable. And therefore, the long-term investments are not guaranteed if you invest in these companies. And it's this very interesting debate because the Republicans are supporting this, also prop up fossil fuel companies who are resisting change. This is actually making these fossil fuel companies who are kind of dinosaurs and will ultimately fossilize in some ways, trying to momentarily prop them up in the short term. Internationally, I think we can say that in the EU, fortunately, the debate is much beyond this. The problem does become that if there is global regulation that applies to both ratings or also to disclosure, the US obviously has a large role to play. So, hopefully this is the debate that in the US will change. But as I said, I mean, fortunately for OMV, as a European company, right now we're adhering to EU standards, which are quite high in this regard, and we're not at risk from this. But yes, I personally can only hope the debate in the US shifts back towards more sustainable investing.
Yeah, and ultimately, if this is what customers and investors want, then companies and governments will have to follow. Since we've talked about the EU and we've talked about the US, we may be getting a bit away from your area of expertise, but what do we know about China? Another key player, it really matters what they do. Is China lagging, leading, somewhere in the middle?
I would say lagging to in the middle in terms of the sustainable investing space. There are, for instance, in Hong Kong, the stock exchange does have ESG criteria that they want companies to disclose. But these are obviously from the standards usually significantly lower than what we apply here in the EU, and also what ESG rating agencies apply, especially in the space of labor rights, for instance, and also environmental pollution protection. There are certainly, even in the APAC regions, countries that are more advanced. Japan is one of them, certainly. Also, for instance, Malaysia, and then you have Australia as a big ESG market. But yes, China, does certainly have a large role to play, but are not quite there yet. And yes, correspondingly, the ESG ratings of Chinese companies tend to also be lower because there is not so much pressure on them from internally to improve.
Okay, so China, if you're listening, Could do better. um, let's come specifically back to OMV. I have to ask you a very big question. How is it possible for an oil, gas, and chemicals company to have a good rating?
That's quite an interesting question. Historically, ESG ratings look at more than just products. And a very good example of this is Tesla. You would expect they're an electric vehicles producer, they would have a great rating. Actually, no, they have poor to average ESG ratings in almost every rating out there. And that's because their product is good, but there's also lots of risks in their business. They have labor rights violations, corporate governance issues. They don't have a low carbon strategy to reduce the emissions in their production, for instance. And meanwhile, a company like OMV, and specifically OMV, has very good sustainability management practices. So that's saying that we focus on everything from safety to reducing our operational emissions to water management, community engagement. So looking at sustainability really holistically, because sustainability is more than just climate, and it's more than just climate-friendly products. So that's the one aspect of it. The other is that historically, ESG ratings companies that do have a lot of disclosure tend to do better because, ESG rating agencies, they're externals. They can only rate what they can see. They cannot just assume that a company is doing well if it doesn't tell them. So therefore, because there's been so much external interest in oil, gas, and gas companies for years, and now increasingly in chemical companies as well, these companies have disclosed more, and that's enabled them to tend to do well in ESG ratings simply because, their disclosure is good. And this is actually where ESG rating agencies also have to change. So the EU is introducing legislation that all large companies in the EU will have to report sustainability information according to a unified set of standards. So ratings can no longer just rate based on disclosure, and they will also have to adapt their methodologies. So it's quite an interesting journey that we're on. Yes, it is possible for an oil, gas, and chemicals company to rate well despite being in a riskier industry.
But it's always about tomorrow. So what could OMV be doing better? What do you need to do better?
Yeah, of course. On the one side, that's that our investors and our ratings are increasingly asking us, well, how are you going to now deliver on this strategy? We announced the strategy last year. We were committed to becoming net zero by 2050, where we also committed to serious absolute emissions reductions targets. And now it's about walking the walk and actually putting our money where our mouth is and demonstrating, well, we're investing this much in these very clean, proven technologies, and also in the long term. So we currently have a strategy for 2030, but the sustainable investing space wants us to have a strategy beyond 2030 and demonstrate this. So that's the one thing. Demonstrating a long-term plan to really meet the 2050 targets. And then there's some aspects that are increasingly growing in importance in sustainability that the world is paying more and more attention to. So for instance, that's biodiversity. Where it's moved away from traditionally you do mitigation. So that means that you, for instance, try to avoid hurting species living near your operation. So, and now it's moving towards demonstrating that you're rehabilitating ecosystems and having a positive impact. So we're also trying to keep pace and make sure that we meet these upcoming trends and are moving away from mitigation to positive impact. And I think that's the challenge that we and a lot of companies are facing at the moment.
So Laura, hip as we are here at Rethinking Resources, our production team asked ChatGPT to chime in on the issue and asked it to come up with some questions. So ChatGPT asks you, how does OMV compare to other companies in its industry in terms of ESG performance?
Our ESG ratings are really, really strong compared to our peers. We're consistently rated in at least the top 10%. In almost all of our ESG ratings that we partake in. So that's everything from MSCI to ISS. And this is really due to a few factors. The one is that we have a very, very strong performance. So historically, we have few safety incidents, for instance, or we don't have huge controversial oil spills, such as BP, which, the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico lowered BP's ESG rating for many years. And this at OMV we don't have. The other is that we're continuously changing and using ESG ratings to really guide both our reporting and the kind of measures that we implement to really stay on top of it, because we do care a lot about our ESG ratings performance. And yeah, we're very proud that all of our endeavors have taken fruit and that we rate really, really well.
Have you asked ChatGPT how you could do better?
I have not.
Okay. Interesting thing to do. You'll have to perform that experiment. Okay, big question here. Let's look toward the future. When we look back at today from the year 2050, okay, so this is where the targets have been set. We look back at today from 2050. What will we say that the introduction of ESG ratings accomplished? Were these a real game changer for the way companies operate? Did they have a positive impact on the world? What will we be saying?
Yes, I think absolutely. As we said at the beginning, it's all about measuring good and making sure that companies are actually doing good. And I think ESG ratings were by far the biggest game changer in the sustainable investing space to ensure that companies are actually held accountable. It moved from voluntary to now legally binding requirements, but companies have for a long time been able to just claim we are sustainable without backing it up. And ESG ratings were really the first time that they were held to account to back up those claims, to not just claim we are sustainable because everyone can scream that, but to demonstrate how they are sustainable. So yes, absolutely. I think ESG ratings were a huge game changer in the industry, and I think they'll continue to evolve, and hopefully have set us on a journey to becoming much more sustainable as a world in general.
Fantastic. Laura Engshuber-Wohnhaas, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, your ideas, your insights with us on Rethinking Resources. To everybody listening, to everybody watching this episode on OMV's YouTube channel, if you have feedback, if you have questions, send us a message to podcast@omv.com. We would love to hear from you. For more background information on the topics we discussed in this episode and on our guest, Laura Engshuber-Wohnhaas, check out our show notes, where you will find links to lots of valuable information. Thank you so much, Laura, for sharing your time with us. Thanks to everybody watching and listening. We hope you will join us again for the next episode of Rethinking Resources.